We worked on a lot of other scenes. Jason Isaacs was disemboweled beautifully, we felt. That was quite a religious scene, that, you know, with the old arms outstretched, and I'm not quite sure if you saw all the beautiful guts that we made lying on the table in front of him, but they were gorgeous, and all the flesh was backlit. I mean, Jason Isaacs is awesome as well. I mean, he had another full body life cast, and in a crippling position. He was standing there and he was refusing, and his arms were shaking, but he did it. He gritted his teeth, he wouldn't give up. He's a fantastic guy.
What you have is a set of teeth which the actor would have worn, and they operate it with their tongue underneath. But this was for someone was like knocking a hammer into the back of someone's head, and then we had to have the tooth be knocked out, blood and guts, everything else. Tiny gag, you know, there's a few days' work in just that alone, and it's probably on the screen for less than 2 seconds, 3 seconds. So there was tons of those little tiny gags which really made up that prosthetic side of things, and really gave moments. But I think it's how they use those moments that count. It may only be 2 seconds, but when they're coming at you, it really does sort of pound the senses. The animatronic side of the film was more to do with things like we had to have a release mechanism for the frozen man to bring it down to actually drop it at exactly the right angle. Paul wanted it to be like a chimney collapsing, so it had to come into the ground and then completely crunch up as it went. So that needed a rig to drop that. There was a burning man, which was an optical technique, which was really sort of something that pushed out the limits a little bit, which was to do with us doing a rod puppet with layers of burning layers, which they'd use for matting and optically put on. So that was another animatronic. And there was the falling rig, which was a great rig for one of the characters had to fall from the top of a really high site and then fall down and smash into the floor, and that was done with an animatronic dummy as well. But I think by far the most complex effect in the film was probably the burning man, because it was made up of so many different layers and so many different techniques. When we finished with it, we were supplying optical elements for them to use later on, but we had to have a material that would burn and deteriorate like flesh and burn onto the next layer and could be done over and over again. I think we shot that for about 8-9 days, that sequence of the optical elements of that. So incredibly complex piece just by itself. Event Horizon had lots of complicated effects because we were trying to push the envelope and really reach out there and get something that the audience hadn't seen before, and something that would really take us to a different place. So I think we were always trying to be very complex effects, very difficult effects, and something you hadn't seen. And I think that's always the hardest effects you can try and do.
Just before Event Horizon started, I was running a company in Los Angeles, and Richard Jurisic was one of our clients. And when Richard became involved in Event Horizon, he knew me well enough to ask me to come back to London with him to be the visual effects producer. The work that I was doing at that time was very much just in the post-production end of things, and so I saw this as a good opportunity to get involved in a film from start right through to the finish. We went over to Pinewood in August, and the film took almost an entire year to complete, from when we started through to when it was released. Richard brought over some other key members of the team from Los Angeles as well, and then we did a lot of local hire for the crew, and we took it from there.
Yeah, there are some specialties involved in the film because we're doing an explosion, which explosions that wouldn't be traditional explosions. We have to photograph like many elements, the scale and the scope of the ship. We have a ship that's intended to be a mile long, so you have to always show that in a big wide master. Well, when you go in to do a close-up and the ship is needed in so many backgrounds and so many pieces, you're talking about how do you scale that down. So we've got a 240th scaled big ship that's 30 feet long. It takes a giant forklift to move it. So our miniatures are really big. We have to put these explosions together in elements. So that's not done that often. I mean, it's done an awful lot from where I came from. But so we brought people along that were used to that, so we could just get into it. And the support we've got and the technicians and the artists and the artisans here has been real good. But our explosion, for example, will have like 8 or 9 elements. I hate to talk numbers and elements, but they had to be done in pieces so they could be reduced and then put together. So there's graphics, explosions, real-size miniatures. So that's the unique part. It's the digital services available here also to put it together are necessary.
To begin with, really, there was quite an open brief. Paul had certain sequences in the script that he wanted us to work on storyboarding. Richard brought over a very talented storyboard artist called Brent Boates, who worked very specifically on the visual effects sequences, although Paul would continually steal him to storyboard other sequences in the film. And really, between Richard, Paul and Brent Boates, they came up with the main effect sequences, the main shots that were involved. Paul was very good because he actually put a lot of trust in Richard Jurisic to really come up with a lot of the ideas about how things were to be done. Richard's background in visual effects goes all the way back to 2001. And a lot of the people in the effects community, if you get a list of the films that made them want to work in visual effects, Richard has worked on a lot of them, things like Blade Runner, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a lot of work with Douglas Trumbull on Brainstorm and Silent Running, and to have someone of Richard's calibre as visual effects supervisor on this film was really quite a coup for Paul to pull off. And I think when you pull in someone of Richard's calibre, you give them pretty free rein to come up with cool stuff. So really from that it was Richard and Paul coming up with these amazing ideas for shots, to begin with, without much regard as to how they were actually going to be accomplished. And then once that was done, Richard sat down to try and figure out how the shots were going to be made.
Well, you know, the techniques, there are many techniques, and we're really not doing anything that the people before us, all the great guys before us, hadn't done before. There's always a new precedent-setting thing that comes up once in a while, and usually it's an accident, sometimes you have to design it. But what you really have to do is you take a look at the script and you reconfigure all those old techniques and pieces of equipment to what's needed for the script. Because you could fall into a trap where you take something necessary in the story and reconfigure it to fit a piece of equipment you have. That's the danger, so you have to resist that, you know. What you do is you try to do you have a bundle of money, a certain amount of money, everybody agrees on it, it's established from before, and you try to get the director what the director wants and the vision and the needs of the script done for that amount of money.
Most of the scenes required some kind of digital help. In all, there are about 400 or so shots in the film that went through the computer. Some of the work was very straightforward. It was just wire or rig removal. Every screen in the film where there's a bit of animation going on was all put in afterwards. There was no on-set playback. And that in itself was quite a huge volume of shots. And then beyond that, there were the obvious special effects shots, a lot of the spaceship work, which was planned right from the start. A lot of the coolant in Zero Gravity and the other Zero Gravity gags. In all, about 400 shots. Many of those came up just through the post-production process, where Paul would decide he wanted to use a certain shot in a different way, and we had to kind of put that together and deal with it.
In this film, in Event Horizon, there are 6 of the sets, major sets, that will be finished in visual effects, and hopefully there'll be hidden visual effects. You won't notice that the set isn't 150 feet long, it's only 30 feet long, and we're trying to make it 100 feet long.
The hero effects shots on Event Horizon we worked on for almost a full year. we started doing some of the initial pre-visualization and planning work before the main unit photography started, and a lot of the shots that were very complicated were delivered right at the last minute, just a couple of weeks before the film was due out. Generally, the way the process worked is that Richard, Paul and Brent Boates would sit down and do some initial sketches and storyboards. And then what Richard had done was a little bit unusual. He had scale models built out of foam core and erected on one of the stages at Pinewood. And then he and Paul, with a small lipstick camera, actually shot all of the angles that Paul wanted to use and experimented with some camera moves that might end up in the finished film. From a lot of that footage, they then went back and re-storyboarded the sequences and worked out really what angles and what shots they wanted. Separately from that, Richard then went away to figure out how feasible it was to achieve many of those shots, what size the models would have to be, how big a stage we needed to erect a lot of the final models on, and what type of motion control equipment we would require to capture the elements that would then be put together in post. The model elements themselves were shot in parallel with the main unit photography, so that Paul was able to review what was being done in the shots at the same time that he was filming with the actors. We turned over a lot of the model elements to the visual effects facilities in order that they could actually start work on some of the more complicated shots while we were still filming. And that worked very well. The two main facilities that were involved in London were Cine and Computer Film Company. Cine were involved in putting together a lot of the spaceship shots and a lot of the zero gravity gags, whereas Computer Film Company were involved in doing all of the screen inserts and all of the shots where the coolant is seen floating in the air. We swapped a lot of the shots around from the two facilities, really depending on how big their workload was in terms of putting the shots together. Paul, of course, in his own inimitable fashion, did manage to throw us a couple of curveballs and come up with some shots spontaneously that we had to respond to. But that's generally taken as being part of the creative process, and I think makes the film a lot better.
Well, Paul's really into visual effects. He understands just about everything to do on the stage. If he's a young man, and if he hasn't seen it before, he learns it first. He knows it before anybody, which is quite good, and really good for us, because I was joking when I said the hardest part, or what's been most difficult, is keeping up with Paul. That, of course, is all directors want as much as they can, and Paul does. If they didn't, they wouldn't be worth too much. But the fact that he's so knowledgeable about doing this and so interested in visuals does give us the time. We don't have to be on the stage at all times to check a plate. I can leave with confidence and know that the plate's going to be okay. Doesn't happen too often.
Overall, there were about 400 effects shots that we worked on digitally. Of those, probably about half of them were pretty straightforward. All of the screens where you see animation or live action happening were all put in after the event. On set, they were just put in with green screen, and then afterwards Computer Film Company tracked and then laid in graphics which were supplied by AMX Digital, who also designed all of the transparencies where they were putting into screens but they weren't actually moving.
I knew the director needed a fireball chasing our hero, Lawrence Fishburne, down the rotating set. It's kind of a unique set. It's very hard to walk in that set, incidentally. He did well running down, because the equilibrium, it really messes with you. So he practiced it. It's not easy. What was intended was a flame bar, a flame to chase him and get close to him. Well, doing it for real, everybody tends to take a long focal length lens and compress the action. When I saw the rotating set, I suggested that if we could rotate it faster, we can shoot an actual flame ball down in a second pass and shoot it at a slower rate of frame rate, with the tunnel rotating twice as fast, 8 RPM, instead of 4 RPM when he was running. Then the two should just marry up real easily, and we got lucky, and they did. Neil Corbold, Physical Effects, who has a hydraulic system rotating that massive set, and Mark Weingartner could time the set, so we actually had a rotation tachometer on the set.
There was also an awful lot of wire and rig work done to actually remove things from set that Paul didn't want in. A lot of the zero gravity stunts involved quite large armatures moving things through shot that we then digitally removed. There were also a fair number of shots where props were created digitally and put into scenes to make it appear as if they're in zero gravity. The two shots that stand out are the first shot on the event horizon inside the main corridor, where there's a large broken water bottle floating around and some other objects. If you look closely, there's a CG book that floats through shots that actually has a picture of Paul Anderson on the front cover, which was his little Hitchcock cameo. The other sequences that I think worked particularly well for computer-generated props were the glove sequence where Miller is first exploring in the event horizon. The main effects work that we had planned right from the start were a lot of the big spaceship shots and also the liquid coolant. I would think in all there were probably about 100 people involved in the different facilities we were using. Certainly for Computer Film Company and the Cine site, while they were working on it, during the post-production period, it was the biggest shows that they were doing. Often they had people on set when we were shooting elements or we were shooting principal photography that they were then going to add things to. They were a core team working right from the start, because we knew that the effects work we were doing was so complicated that unless we actually had the artists involved right from the pre-production, the planning stage, then it would be much more difficult to put together. And it's a credit as much to those companies that the work looks as good as it does.
You let me burn!
Well, the technique is a flamethrower device, and to make it reach the length of the tunnel, there was difficulty to get it go down through the tunnel because the fire will chase the air, the oxygen. It wants oxygen to burn. So that set, if you noticed, as it was rotating, had holes in it and little fans and fins. So there's a lot of oxygen. So it's sitting there ready like a dragon. When the flame comes and catches it, it joins it and comes as a thrust. So we shoot it in slow motion at the frame rate described for the man running. When we used the long lens and tightened his action down, the set was rotating at 4 RPM, and we photographed the set now with the flame at 12 RPM and 3 times the amount of film. So that again, when you laid them down in registration, it would fit the set. We could also place the fire as close to him as we wanted, what was needed for the film, to make it look as though it gained on him, because we could do the different speeds. It's just a little trick. After the fireball chases him down the tunnel, he dives through and saves the day. Ha-ha. No, he doesn't. The flame comes through the door. We don't know what's happening yet. And it takes on the shape of a man. We call him the Burning Man in this film. And he's quite a character. He has to burn. So we haven't developed him totally. We have all the pieces ready to put together. This piece here, the feet, we call those the crispy feet. This is the crispy feet walk through this tank of water. In the scene, in the set, you'll notice there was some water behind. For some reason, the crispy man strikes Lawrence, knocks him into the water, and then he walks in afterwards. So to show that he's in the water, we have a cut on his feet. And again, the director Paul and I talked and thought it was cool. Paul wanted him to walk in there, and he gave us the okay to try and have him burning, and it required the robot. So we have a robot here in motion control with the camera that's following him, and we've got him walking towards the camera as though he's the real man. So we've shot actually 7 or 8 elements here. We've got him walking with steam coming out of his legs. We've got him walking crispy. We've got him walking with black legs on flame. We've got him walking in and out of the water in different frame rates. Every one of those, again, come on top of each other. So selectively, we'll have to edit and select certain flames. Then when we put it together, we'll have to hide our flaws by maybe using some computer-generated flames or some other pieces. But the end result, we hope, is him walking in the water. It's been accepted. The timing and the movement is nice. But we hope to see into the water, because he's the burning man. He's going to burn everywhere. So he's going to burn underwater.
I think the single shot that stands out as being the most complicated and also one of the most effective is what we call the daylight station pullback, which is Sam Neill opening the shutters at his, on his apartment, and then the camera pulling back through this enormous space station gantry work and revealing the Earth below. And that was an incredibly complicated shot to plan and to actually execute. And that was really the first shot that we did, and the last shot that was actually delivered. And I think even looking at it now, there are still 1 or 2 things that we'd like to go back and continue working on. The reason it was so complicated is that we had to build a a number of different scales of the same miniature, and it's a huge credit to David Sharp that he was able to do this and then replicate the camera move through it all. David Sharp and David Stewart, who was the motion control cameraman, worked on planning out exactly how the move was going to work, and with Richard managed to pre-visualize it in such a way that after we'd shot the individual elements and turned them over, CineSite were able to very quickly put it together and make sure that it worked, and then actually start work on the shot towards final. Certainly when we looked at even the dailies, it was a very disorienting piece of work to look at, and it was so complex that I think even with Richard explaining how it was going to work, no one actually believed him that it would work. And it's quite amazing now how effective it is in the film.
What you try to do is blend all of your shots in the best you can with the assets that you have at hand, so that it becomes a continuum of experience. We've got, I can't really focus on what it is because there's so much. We've got so many things to do. We are part, really, the visual effects. I wouldn't call this a visual effects film. It's just film. It's part of the filmmaking that we're going to require visual effects. It's probably one of the best examples to date of a film that couldn't be done without the visuals, because nobody has a stage large enough to build the 800-foot spaceship in. So we have to trick the audience when we can. And Paul's real clever, and he has a cutter too. We established that the scope and the size of the ship, and hopefully it'll go past and no one will think that it was done in visuals.
In terms of which sequence I'm most proud of, the opening shot of the Event Horizon, when the camera rakes in across it and the sunlight filters through the gantry work, I think visually is one of the best shots. In fact, though, I think the most impressive work is a lot of the effects shots that perhaps the audience wouldn't notice or wouldn't be sure whether it was shot for real or CG. I particularly like a very short sequence when Miller is first exploring the Event Horizon and is startled by the CG glove. I think a lot of the lighting in that, which was done in CG, works very, very well. And likewise, when they're first in the main corridor, and there's a camera shot with the water bottle that's been shattered, and there are little bits of ice hanging in the air, and the torchlight that comes up through that. Those are the kind of details, I think, that really make a huge difference into how well the computer-generated objects are integrated into live action.
This place is a tomb.